Oh, I should tell you who I am before I introduce the first speaker this afternoon. So I'm Danel Padilla-Peralta. I teach at Princeton University for the time being, and ASU. I mean, I wouldn't object. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jackie Murray, whose presentation is entitled The Monstrous Female, Racing Homer's Women.
Well, thank you, Danelle, for that wonderfully lavish introduction. Keeping it sweet. The Monstrous Female, Racing Homer's Women. Now, the approach that I'm going to present is trying to use race as a hermeneutic mode of interpretation. And I'm sure in this audience it's not going to be necessary to explain that in antiquity, race was not defined in the way it is today in terms of phenotype and skin color, but that doesn't mean that race did not exist in antiquity, I would argue. And so I want to discuss how race works in the use of poetry, the fictional world, to sort of reinforce ideas that are out there in the real world. So the fictional world of epic, more than any other ancient Greek poetic form, I would argue, is replete with terrifying monsters that threaten gods and heroes, the demigods. Now, the most authoritative of the Greek epics, Hesiod's Theogony and Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, tended to provide a lieu de mémoire for the various ideologies that undergirded the real world, male supremacist, patriarchal, and I would argue racist social order. And I'm hardly saying anything new or controversial by claiming that the depiction of monsters in epics or other literature reflect a collective conceptual framing of a social order where certain people, certain groups of people are substantially different in terms of their humanity than others. And such conceptual framings did operate in ancient Greek communities, but in not necessarily the same manifestations in every Greek community. There's no homogeneous ancient Greek community, just so we get that clear. Most people are only really familiar with 5th century Athens, but in different communities there are different makeups. So monstrification, which is crucial to the aspect of racialization that I am interested in, manifests in these authoritative modes of storytelling as a way of framing what I'm arguing is the racial dynamic. So in epic discourse then, the male heroic body is the site, the exclusive site of inalienable humanity. And monstrosity is the concrete realization of the necessary corollary to that is for non-heroes, and that is all other humans in the epic world that are not heroes, they have alienable or even alienated humanity. So the literal monsters are metaphorically linked to these non-heroes, producing racialization that tends to become salient depending on certain circumstances within the text at large. And especially when humans engage in dehumanizing violent actions toward them. So in my recent discussion of the Odyssey, I argued that the enslaved shepherds on Ithaca, who are subject to violence and to a double standard of living that marks them out as inferior, are a racialized group precisely because they are associated metaphorically to the monstrified shepherd, the Cyclops. So now a lot of in discussions of this piece that I've had since it's published, always comes up the question: how do women then fit into the system, seeing that many of the monsters, especially in the Odyssey and in Hesiod, are female? And it has often been observed in earlier feminist interpretations that most of the most terrifying monsters, the ones that are associated with overwhelming natural forces, also tend to be female. And so, and I would argue then that Homer borrows or is operating in the same mythical universe that Hesiod's Theogony is, where Gaia, the earth, the quintessential monster, and the mother of all monsters, serves to be the sort of metaphorical vehicle for female monstrosity. And so then there's been a tendency to see the monstrous, there's a tendency to see, to see monstrosity of females as a marker of gender, and without any conception or attention to the possibility that this could be a racial discourse. So here, I'd like to address this question by offering a theorization that I'm open to challenge and help with, of epic racecraft that uses the discourse of monstrosity to construct, naturalize, and justify the racialization of all non-heroes, including women. And so I'll begin, let me see my outline here. Does that work? It's not doing anything, is it? It's not moving. Okay, we gotta go the other way, all right. Yeah, okay, this is my outline. So I'll begin by briefly exploring the discourse of monstrosity in Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days, just briefly, focusing precisely on the creation of the first woman, Pandora, who I argue is racialized through her metaphorical association with all the other monstrous females in the text. And then I'll show that this same discourse operates, the discourse of monstrosity operates in the Homeric texts, racializing the women in those texts. And then I'll turn to look precisely at instances in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and how race is socially constructed through monstrification and dehumanizing violence. So first, let's look at what I'm talking about when I say race. It's not really working. Okay, there we go. Okay. And so I'm going to be drawing on work that's probably familiar to most of you, Barbara and Karen Field's racecraft. And I argue that this discourse of monstrosity in the Homeric epics and in Hesiod is a racializing discourse. It serves to naturalize and justify the hatred that's behind the hero's violence, that tends to be dehumanizing, in that they treat the bodies of their opponents, their non-heroic opponents, with undue atrocious violence. And thus it fits into this idea of justifying and naturalizing race that they consider racecraft. And the definition I'll be using then is treating race as a verb as opposed to the noun category. And I'm paraphrasing Elena Giusti's forthcoming article on racializing Dido. So race in this understanding is inexplicable from the processes, the violent, dehumanizing processes that perpetuate these hierarchies and hierarchical relationships that are arbitrarily composed. Now, just to give you a sense that this is not just a modern understanding of how seeing race as a process. It's not something that we can just say, oh, okay, we just made that up in the 21st century. In fact, Homer actually talks about I think he talks about racialization in this way. In Odyssey 17, 322 to 23, he says, half of a man's excellence, broad-seeing Zeus, removes from him whensoever the day of slavery overpowers him. So what Homer is not here subscribing to any kind of natural slavery idea that there are people who are born as slaves. And of course, I'm eliding slavery and race together because slavery as one of the dehumanizing processes is a way of creating race. Homer says, yeah, that the man, the hero, presumably, loses half of his human excellence, and I would say that is his humanity, the day he is overpowered by slavery. So slavery is a process, even in Homer's mind, of producing a racialized being that is now going to be subject to violence and dehumanization. And so this is where I insist that when we see enslaved people in the Homeric texts, we have to reckon with the fact that they have been racialized by this process. So the verse prima facie then is that no one is born enslaved, but the process of being enslaved robs you of your human dignity. So those who can be enslaved have alienable humanity. And let's see if I can go a little bit further here. Yeah. Okay. So as I said earlier, the site of inalienable humanity is the male heroic body, and exclusively the male heroic body, which then means that bodies that are non-male are automatically in the alienable category in terms of their humanity. And I've argued before that this is why then the shepherds, because they are monstrified, they're believed to have a non-human internal metaphysic. That is why they are moved into the racialized group. Now, when it comes to women, however, you have an even added level of justification or a way of reaching for a justification through the fact that women and intersex people have different bodies from men. So you can then appeal to nature to justify the treatment. And so these non-male bodies then become monstrous. So here you have an image of Achilles slaying Penthesilea, both warriors. However, one is female and she's painted in white, and Achilles is painted in black. And so the women are, even though she's a warrior, she is still not the same as him. And here, the skin color actually, which marks women, is actually, I would say here, could actually overlap with racialization, because white skin in antiquity, certainly in this period, was not associated with the heroic male body, right? So her white skin here is what is monstrifying her as a warrior in this text. Now, okay, let's move a little bit forward. Now, in terms of Pandora, we have to go back to the fact that, well, why is it that women are created in this text, the Hesiod's Theogony, where the whole, I would argue, the whole overarching argument is that it is to establish Zeus's supremacy over all the other gods, and Zeus being the quintessential male god, it also is a text embodying male supremacy. And so within this text, you then have the creation of the first woman, Pandora, who is created as evil for men, precisely to punish those that Prometheus has helped out. So Zeus is punishing the other gods via punishing the humans that they care for, and the humans that they care for presumably are all male, and so we're going to create a female monster to handle that. And since they're mortals and they're not necessarily heroes, they might not be able to handle this monster that's going to be set into their world. And so, as I said, but she gains her monstrosity precisely because within this text, where Zeus is set up as the ultimate god, there's been generation after generation where the gods fight various monsters. Gaia produces all of these monsters, many of them female, and I would argue that they then transfer their monstrosity to Pandora. All right, so within this universe, then, okay, that's the right one? I think it's this one. Yeah, okay. So within this universe, then, you have the male, I put it on this is my Continuum slide. So you have the male inalienable humanity. And everybody else does not have alienable humanity, certainly from that male supremacist perspective. And I would argue that heroines, the female counterpart to the male hero, actually are not within that inalienable humanity group either, because they can be enslaved and they can be dehumanized, and we'll talk about that when I get to the Iliad. So they have their alienable humanity, or they enjoy some inalienable humanity insofar as they have a male hero protecting them, in the same way that your slave can't be damaged by anybody because he's your property. So it's the same kind of transference of value to women, the heroine women, that goes with the slave. Now, but because they are inalienable or have alienable humanity, they, as I said, they can be moved along this scale. And once they're moved into slavery, obviously, they then become the racialized group that cannot be changed. And so this is how I would schematize it. Now let's see if I can go next slide. Okay, I'm going the wrong way, I think. Okay, here we go. All right. So now let's go to the Iliad. So the first thing I want to talk about is a little bit about how men, the heroes themselves, there seems to be in the Iliad a taboo on heroes dehumanizing other heroes. This is the main theme of the Iliad. We start off with the idea that the wrath of Achilles is causing the bodies of warriors to lie out on the battlefield and be eaten by birds and dogs. So this is the complete dehumanization of the human body. This is not supposed to happen, right? And so we see this constantly being reiterated throughout the text, that this is not supposed to happen. When Athena warns Diomedes not to go too far in his berserker mode, she reminds him of his father's berserker situation, where he was so enraged that he ate the heart of his enemy. And that caused him to lose divine favor. So similarly, too, when Achilles mistreats the body of Hector and refuses to allow it to be buried, what he's doing is he's engaging, I would argue, he's engaging in racializing Hector at that moment. And the gods don't approve of that. They don't approve of heroes dehumanizing other heroes, even if they are of another nation that you're fighting with. At least that's Homer's presentation. However, that's not the case for heroine women, right? This is the main concern of folks like Andromache and the women in Troy, is that when Troy falls, when Hector is no longer their protector, they will then be subject to the consequences that come with that, which is to be dehumanized. And indeed, the very first issue in the Iliad as well, the fight over Chryseis, is precisely that, right? She is a captured woman or girl, and she will be subject to rape and forced labor and trafficking, right? All as part of the consequences of her father or her city not being able to protect her. So women, this is what happens in the Iliad to show you that this is the Iliad is much more clear about the process by which women become racialized. And there are monsters, mentioned, not central to the text as in the Odyssey, but there are monsters alluded to, as in the Chimera, the story of the Chimera that comes up. The Chimera is a female monster. Athena is wearing the Gorgon, which is the disembodied. So the Chimera here is the top picture, and the Gorgon with her head cut off, that is the other monster. Those are mentioned in the text, so lurking in the background as the heroes slaying these female monsters. Right? All right, so let's move on quickly. I can, open up to text later. So here's the image of Achilles dragging Hector's body around the walls of Troy. Now, the next one should be here. Whoops, did I miss one? The Odyssey. There we go, the Odyssey. Yeah. And so in the Odyssey, there are many more female monsters. Odysseus's adventures involve, struggles with monsters, Cyclopes, Scylla, Charybdis, Sirens, etc. So many of the monsters he engages with are female, like the Cyclops not, but the others are. And I want to focus in particular with Scylla, since work has been done by Hauptmann on Scylla, where she using conceptual metaphors, points out that, Scylla is woman and sea is woman and dog, and you can see the dogs coming out of her genitalia there. However, what's interesting is Hauptmann doesn't actually make the obvious one, which is Scylla is woman and monster, right? And that's, again, it's this tendency to avoid a racializing discourse about that. Now, what's interesting is that the dog aspect of Scylla is tied precisely to when Odysseus sees the enslaved women in his palace, right, who he's going to punish for being disobedient to him or disloyal to him by sleeping with the suitors. Now, the narrative, of course, presents their engaging in sex with the suitors as if it were consensual. However, they are enslaved women, and there's 108 suitors. Let's just be clear, 108 suitors who are heroes. The women don't really have a choice. However, the narrative presents it as if they do, and has Odysseus watching as the women are engaging in sex with the suitors, and it says that his heart sort of leapt up and barked at him, but also that he remembered when the Cyclops destroyed smashed his men and treated it like puppies and basically ate them. So watching the women being raped, Odysseus is understanding that, or comparing that to the Cyclops killing his puppies, and the racialization aspect of that is clear. The women are dogs, right? And so he's watching the other heroes kill his dogs, but no recognition of the humanity of the women is presented there. And so when he then later punishes them with an atrocious, gruesome punishment, it's all justified because of the fact that they have this inner monstrosity that they gain from their association with Scylla and the other monsters in the text. Okay, and then let's see. So now I'm going to go to the conclusion. Whoops, sorry. Okay, whatever. I can't, sorry, I'm so bad with the slides. Yeah, but it doesn't really matter. Like the last thing just said conclusion. So in conclusion, so this presentation, I'm really want to have more conversation. So I'm trying to show that race can be a productive hermeneutic tool for understanding the role that epic plays in creating an ancient Greek racial imaginary. And I tried to argue that this discourse of monstrosity that we see in these texts is racecraft. It provides a metaphor for justifying and naturalizing the violent and dehumanizing processes of racialization that take place in the text, whether they are against subaltern men, non-hero men, but also women as well. women as a class of beings, by virtue of their non-maleness, or have this alienable humanity, even if they are heroines, and that unless the heroes associated with them can extend sufficient protection, they are only their humanity is only contingent, and they're thus vulnerable to racialization. And so there's this tendency to want to isolate the various oppressions that an individual can experience, whether it's class, race, gender, etc., into discrete categories. However, this tends to ignore the fact that often these oppressions are experienced at the same time. And so I wanted to try to think about the Homeric poems and recognize that in the case of some women, particularly enslaved women in the text, these oppressions are coalescing in their same, the site of their own bodies. Okay, so thank you, and I'm happy to take some questions. I hope that was within time. So you have questions or after?
How is this workshop Western?
We got somebody back there.
Thank you. My name is Shuki Elhamo. I teach here. It's fascinating epistemological approach. Why? It's because when I study the ancient text, well, I didn't study them well like you, I see patriarchy and sexism. Mm-hmm. But it's amazing how actually that when we look for something, we find it.
Yes.
So now you're looking at it from the perspective of race, and which is interesting because that's what I do in North Africa within the Islamic period. So I don't want to say much except a question. Does this fit the Virgil poem, Virgil epic, the Song of Solomon, Makeda and Solomon? Do they fit in this paradigm?
Well, I can't speak to the Song of Solomon, but I can speak to the Aeneid, and I would say yes, it does fit with the Aeneid. And in fact, I mentioned Elena Giusti, whose paper on racializing Dido would help that, because in addition to you have the issue of the Carthaginians being projected in the text, who are already racialized by the Romans by then, right? By the time Virgil is created, they've already conquered Carthage, and Carthaginians have been subjected to, what is it, expulsion and slavery, whatever, right? And so when we see how you can use, I think you can use race as a lens to look at how Carthaginians are represented in Dido, and how that works. But also, I do think that, so I've done looking at the shepherds in the Aeneid as well. Like Aeneas, oddly, bizarrely, is identified with the shepherd, which in normal Greek epic, that's the enslaved person. So and Turnus is actually leading a bunch of shepherds too in his. Metaphorically anyhow, or I think his people are actually shepherds, whereas Aeneas is the shepherd as he's attacking the city. And so I've argued that that's actually conjuring up the fear that Romans have of slave revolts, where the shepherds are kind of highly involved in that outcome. And so you're associating the tendency in the Aeneid is to bring together all the wars that the Romans have had at that point. And so what I would suggest is that the references to the shepherds, the enslaved shepherds in the Aeneid, or Aeneas leading shepherds and Turnus leading shepherds, this is calling in the fear of the slave revolts as well as another part of Roman history within the text. But yeah, you can. I think you definitely can, because of the fact that in antiquity, slavery was not necessarily connected to. It was often part of conquest, right? And but not always, but often part of conquest. And you could also be sold into slavery, etc., right? So it's not, the model that I use would be possible in that kind of situation. I can't speak to Solomon, though, because I haven't really studied that. Good question. Thank you. There's a question here.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to hear you present. I had a question about the applicability of your model, perhaps, and you were not talking about this, so it might not. So it's okay if you don't have any thoughts on it. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts when we think about kind of Homeric fan fiction, and I'm thinking specifically of Statius, right?
Yeah.
And the Iliad, and what happens when there we have Achilles being trained as a hero, right, by a centaur, right, like someone that Chiron, that falls within that monstrosity spectrum, and
right.
also when he is enters the court of King Lycomedon, I think it was, but he pretends to be a woman, right, and of course he comes back to being that essential like male heroic identity.
Right.
But yeah, do you have thoughts on like how flexible this male heroic masculinity is, perhaps, and what happens in this case when we apply that model to perhaps this text by Statius?
Well, yeah, no, I do think that it would be, it's probably applicable. I haven't looked at it 100%, but just thinking about it, yeah, it is really interesting that from the, I mean, there is the problem of Achilles himself in the Iliad being a monster. Like, he is a monster in the, that's the problem, right? He himself, his anger is changing him from being, making him into being kind of like a Tydeus figure, because the, in book 6 where you have Andromache is telling Hector, oh, you know, okay, don't worry, if you go on the battlefield, he's a decent guy, you know, blah, blah, blah. You know, he was nice to my dad back in the day. So outside of the Iliad, in the, you know, he was a human being, right? But but on the battlefield with Hector, right, he loses his mind. He's like, when Hector says, okay, one of us is gonna die, let, you know, whoever it is, let's just be reasonable at this point, and so, you know, give the body back, blah, 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 as we're supposed to do according to the norm, right? And Achilles says, no, there's no contract between lions and sheep. Like, so he sees himself as something different, and, you know, has the right to devour Hector, which is very much like the way Tydeus is represented on the battlefield. So I think I'm a fan of Statius. So I think to a certain extent that Statius is calling in these critiques of Achilles. The female Achilles that Plato already made, where he says, you know, when Achilles behaves like a woman, you know, bringing in the Skyros episode as a critique, and then also I think the centaur thing is also probably a critique of something, because he himself at the end of the epic, what we have, right, he says, no, this is really how I was educated. I was even worse than the centaurs, right? But, you know, so he himself wants to see himself to be this monster that he then becomes, according to Statius, the way he sets up the chronology, he becomes that, the Iliadic Achilles that we get in the Iliad. So this is before, and then, yeah. So I do think, yeah, that there's something going on with where he's critiquing that. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, there's a question here.
I think this is kind of a follow-up to that, but do you think that acts of atrocity in this sort of way, which is like with Hector's body being dragged by Achilles sort of around the walls of the city, compel racialization?
Yeah, yeah, I do think that it's these kinds of acts, the acts of dehumanizing the person or the group is where it is. I spent the semester in Berlin, and we did this walk where it was an artist walk where they have these signs about each of the Nazi laws that were promulgated, and they're all very like drip, 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 but each one is like dehumanizing the Jews at the time, right? And so it's this creation of a race, and we know that that's what they were doing. They were creating a racialized group. So it's these actions that you know, that take away your human dignity. So I think burial is one of the recognitions of human dignity, proper burial, and it showed. And I think in Epic that's very clear that not burying people, mistreating their body, is doing something dehumanizing. Now, so I'm saying that as a process, that happens, it's a way of racializing. Because you only do that to people that you throw away, right? You don't care about, right? And have and there's no consequence. You don't expect consequences to come as well. That's another thing. And so you're not allowed to do it to heroes because there are consequences. So Achilles has to give the body back. He has to stop what he's doing because the gods are demanding it, right? But yeah, so I do think that it is, as I said, I agree with the idea that race is a verb. Like it is the processes that produce as the Fields and sisters talk about, it's these acts of continually reaffirming the fact that these people are not human enough, right? And so and these are the various ways.
Thanks, Jackie. That was such a great talk, and I was really taken by your phrase, epic racecraft. I think that's yours, right? Which is so great. So I was wondering if you could address whether you think this is a function of epic, which would then go into early modern, medieval epics or early modern epics, or just of Greek epic.
No, I think it's a function of epic. The genre. Yeah, because the genre has an authority over other poetic genres because it approaches history, right? Like it is sort of approaches, it's not history because, you got monsters, but it approaches, it presents a history that you take to be authoritative, right? And you take to be the truth, not necessarily in the facts that they were frying griffins and whatnot. Okay, nobody's into that. But the fact that it comes from a source of authority, right? And so it's that part of it that all epics pretend to, right? They pretend to be giving you an authority, a story that has an authoritative backing. And so then because the way it presents the social relations within that, and then people take it away, that's how it does. I mean, you just have to consider how people freak out whenever you present Achilles as black. Like, or God forbid mermaids as black. Like, just people lose their minds, right? So, but why, right? Because of the fact that there is this. Granted, in our case, there's also there's also the taking of that the ancient epic and processing through whiteness to make it that. But it's because of the fact that the text itself already has a discourse of monstrosity that can be massaged into any racialized discourse, right? So, yeah.
Oh, I love the talk. I love the talk so much. I want to invite you to reflect on a feature of the talk, a formal element of the talk, which is that you develop an argument about monstrification as a structuring principle in epic, focusing on the Odyssey and the Iliad, but also gesturing to Hesiod. That's grounded very much in text, right? You zero in on particular moments in these texts. I love your discussion of Eumaeus' line about the taking away of half a man's virtue. But another part of your argument is a visual one. It is about the iconographies that emerge in conjunction with the formalization of epic as authoritative, and that yield, in the course of the archaic and early classical moment, these very rich and supple vocabularies for conceptualizing monstrosity and as racecraft. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on this, on the visual iconographic landscapes that give a sort of activating force to some of the ideas that are immanent in these epics.
Yeah, exactly. No, in the fact that we have these images that I've just presented, right? That the description of the monsters. There's always these detailed descriptions often of the monsters, as if we want them to be painted or drawn, right? So that it's not just in the imagination, but also we want something tangible out there in the natural world. And then that reinforces it. So because the construction is this metaphysic thing. It's something that's not tangible, right? But you want to give it some kind of embodiment, whether it's in art, whether it's actually in picking out some feature of the group that you can say, okay, their dark skin is the indicator of their monstrosity, right? But you want to have something that is rooted in nature, rooted in the physical world. And so, yeah, the descriptions created in your mind, but then someone paints it, right? And then I mean, just think about, again, the adaptations of the epic is where the problem starts, right? Because immediately, once you have let's say the monster, the mermaid, let's just go with the monster mermaid, right? The minute you don't go with what people imagine, the collective imagination of the mermaid, people lose their minds. Why? Because they've already got this thing set up there, and all the other images that they've seen, right, have reinforced that. And so similarly with the Greek heroes, the appropriation of the heroes for whiteness has perpetuated this idea that the heroes are white. And then when, you know, this is how you know that it's a racial discourse. Like, it's because the minute you don't go with that, everybody goes nuts, right? So that's the, yeah, so I take your point.
Beautiful talk. I want to ask about daughters and the daughters of heroes, because it seems to me, at least, I really want to ask about Helen, and I want to ask about how some women are more alienatable than others.
Right.
I mean, she is the woman whose face launched 1,000 ships, but there's also that sense that it was wrong to take her in particular. Like, it's not just it's wrong to take a woman, it's wrong to take this woman.
Right.
And I'm wondering, well, I agree that all women can have an alienable humanity. It seems that some women in the epics have stickier humanities than others.
Yes, absolutely, and that's what I had the go back to my slide. If I can, slides won't. Maybe the guy back there could get my continuum slide up, the one with the continuum, right? Because next one more, go back. Yeah, that's it, right? So some heroines, again, remember, it depends on to what degree they have protection from the hero. Or in her case, Helen's case, Zeus is her protector. Zeus is her father, right? And so that's why Menelaus himself can't do anything at the end of the war. He has to accept her back, right? So she, because her father, because her divine status, right, is backed by the most powerful god in the universe here. Well, yeah, sure, she can she can't be treated badly, even when she's done something wrong, or they perceive she's done something wrong, or whatever. However, the point is that she belongs to, according to the marriage rules, whatever, she belongs to Menelaus. And notice, you can't, as Paris, just waltz in and take this guy's wife, right? Because that's treating him as if he's not a hero. And guess what? That produces massive consequences. It's a whole world war, right? And it's not just, I don't think it's just because, Agamemnon is greedy or whatever. It's also because it's part of a system that's justifying the right of heroes to protect their property, their women property, whether they're daughters or wives, right? And so, because otherwise, then you can take them and enslave them and do what Agamemnon claims he's going to do with Chryseis, right? And the father has to just stand there and do nothing, but he can call on the god, though, to change the situation, right? So there's a sense where the dehumanization of the female characters is susceptible to the extent to which the male characters, male heroes, can protect them, can exert their protection over them, right? And this is the same. So it's in a sense, women are property, because that's the kind of sort of value that they have. That's why I claim that it's alienable. Helen may be all the way up to inalienable a little bit because, well, she's got Zeus as her backup, but all the other heroines, for the most part, are in the close to that green zone of alienable, right? Not in the yellow zone. So, yeah. Thank you for that question.
I think that takes us to time, so can we get another round of applause for Dr. Jackie Murray?